Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Soyle podcast. My name is Tom LC Shipp,
I'm Jack Gleeson.
And I'm SK.
and today we have a guest.
I'm Matt.
Matt, who are you to us?
I've known you guys for quite some years outside of the podcast, and way back to when we were little babs. As far as relevancy to why I'm here, I've been playing D&D for 20 years. I've done a lot of story writing and development and things of that nature.
So today's topic of the podcast, we're going to be talking about the villains of stories, the opposite of the good guys, the bad guys, the mad scientists, the cruel executives, the evil witches and wizards, the corrupt politicians, and all such evils. You can define a villain in different ways. You can define them in terms of the story's morality, in that if you see the story's morality on a spectrum of good to bad, villain obviously representing the bad side of the spectrum, and usually either trying to inhibit the protagonist from attaining their goal, or trying to get the same goal, or a different goal where they cannot be the same. That was complicated. But there are other definitions as well, which we'll talk about.
Before we move on from that, I think another thing that we should point out about defining a villain is more than just being an antagonist or a protagonist or anything like that. A villain isn't always the antagonist of a storyline. Like, there are plenty of stories where the villain is very often the main character, making them a protagonist, where the hero would be the antagonist to that villain. You know, there's just different perspectives. Like, just because the villain is the bad guy, that does not make them the antagonist. Like, the definition...
Generally speaking, it does. Generally.
Well, right. Generally. But, you know, there's plenty of stories, I'm just saying, that the protagonist and the antagonist kind of have more reversed roles, whereas the protagonist, as far as my definition of a protagonist and antagonist go, the protagonist is the major character that the storyline revolves around. Whether the protagonist or antagonist is a villain or hero, it just depends on the story. It's very common for the villain to be much more proactive than the hero of the storyline, where the villain is trying to make things happen and the hero of the story is more trying to play catch-up or thwart whatever actions the villain is taking to make change.
Right. This is usually because of the power scenario between the hero and villain. The villain is usually of a higher power situation, or they have more knowledge, or they have more action ability than the hero. So a lot of times the villain is in a better position to do things, and the hero has to play catch up.
There are rare circumstances where I feel like, you know, the hero's power is kind of without question. Take One Punch Man, for example. Saitama is the strongest character in that universe, but villains are showing up time and time again to cause havoc and chaos, etc. And Saitama is really just trying to... I mean, he's not necessarily trying to prove anything to himself. He's in a state of mind where he feels like there's almost no point to being a hero because he can't test himself, right? So when villains show up, he's trying to test himself. But in that sense, you know, the villain is still being more proactive because villain shows up, does something, Saitama shows up and stops them.
In that scenario, I think, in One Punch Man anyway, that Saitama is sort of a modern myth representation. Because in a lot of mythology, once the hero has attained their abilities, they become godlike, and after that point, the hero may go on many adventures like Hercules does. Right. But he becomes so capable and so powerful that it doesn't matter how proactive the villain is, Hercules is still going to beat everyone to death. It doesn't matter what the villain does. The hero is omni-capable. So I wouldn't even consider that Saitama has any true villains, because he's already too powerful. They're just fodder. They're just time wasting for him. He doesn't have any antagonists.
Well, I mean, there's plenty of antagonists, but it's
not directly to him.
Right.
They don't
it's
really
more
do
like an antagonist
him.
Of like the organization, or like it's an antagonist of, I guess, the world.
So barring a hero who's omniscient and omnipowerful.
Right.
Let's look at regular people. I see you highlighting Gollum in the notes.
Right.
So I feel like that is a good topic for what a villain actually is in terms of the storyline's narrative, is when we look at those three characters.
Which characters are those?
SK, I don't know.
You want me to go dry into Lord of the Rings like we always do?
You brought it up last time, dude.
I don't know what the segue was. We were talking about Lord of the Rings, and then I brought up Gollum.
We were talking about proactivity of villains, right? And so then we
were
brought
talking about how
up...
fucking lame Sauron was.
Exactly.
You know who's not a proactive villain? Sauron.
So I would completely agree.
I would too.
And, like, when we look at the Lord of the Rings, right, I feel like it's hard to pinpoint who the villain of that storyline would, because a lot of people would say Sauron, but Sauron doesn't do anything in, like,
exactly.
the movie's adaptations. Like, so granted, I've only read The Hobbit, so I guess I don't have a lot more information as far as the Fellowship, Two Towers, and Return of the King.
But most people also only have the trilogy's experience, so...
Like, Sauron is the idea of the villain in that, right? Because he's the guy that created the ring. He's the person that's trying to plunge Middle-earth into darkness, but, like, he doesn't do dick. He's a giant floating eyeball on the top of a tower that just has a bunch of little pawns that are somehow under his control or working for him, or he's working through them, or... I don't know, it's not entirely clear to me.
I guess knowing the mythology, I can explain that Sauron was part of an immortal race who tricked the elves into creating magical rings, and then learned their secrets to craft his own ring that was more badass than everybody else's ring, and he basically used that to fill his hatred and corrupt the other rings, to make all the rulers terrible and terrorize their own people and start wars, and... Eventually, he got defeated in the battlefield, and he lost his corporeal form, but he is an immortal being according to the mythology of the story. So it just was a matter of time until he returned, and so that's his wanting to bring darkness to the Middle-earth was the reason why Gandalf, Frodo, the whole Fellowship of the Ring, decided to destroy the ring once and for all, because they knew until they did that Sauron would keep coming back.
Because his life was somehow tied to the Ring of Power?
Right, the ring gives him his more power. So, like, over the centuries, so, like, the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring is, like, centuries after the defeat of Sauron. And in all that time, like, the myth of Sauron became legend. It became, like, almost, like, not even... true, just a legend. But he was slowly rebuilding his ethereal power. And the tower is supposed to represent this, like, ethereal realm. It's not that his eyes on. It's not like a real tower. It's like the ethereal eye tower.
I love that. I love that. The dude's... It's so long ago that he's basically a legend, but he's got a fucking glowing eye that's staring down at everybody that anyone could see. Like, oh yeah, that's totally not him. That's totally not that eternal dickhead over there.
The problem with it, though, is that, at least in the movies, I understand there's a lot of backstory, and I know in the books he does some other stuff afterward, but in the movies, at least, he doesn't really do much. We see him get defeated at the very beginning. We understand that the ring is tied to his power, and that when it's destroyed, he's destroyed. But, in the movies, they never really show the ramifications of him getting the ring. So you don't fully understand the stakes other than, I guess, the world would end or whatever. But that's never really
I think it's like that.
Given like an
like
actual
Game
example.
Of Thrones. Like
Game
of
of
Thrones, White Walkers kind of thing.
That's the problem with those types of things. They're big, evil, scary thing, but
they're too
without any
generalized,
concrete. Yeah, it's just like they just represent evil for evil's sake, as opposed to having an actual bad idea for the world.
Sauron essentially functions as a primordial force. He stopped being a character at the beginning of the movie, and he was barely a character then. He's just a symbol after a certain point.
Right.
Yeah.
And if we're talking
Whereas
about
Saruman would be a much more, would be a much stronger villain of the story, at least the first two movies.
I would say that Saruman functions as the villain's implement.
He's the action behind Sauron.
But in terms of the actual overarching Lord of the Rings story, the true villain in terms of the hero versus the antagonist, we're talking about Frodo and Gollum.
Gollum's Frodo's perfect antagonist because he actually challenges Frodo's weaknesses, which is, he's constantly struggling with being overtaken by the ring, and Gollum obviously has already been taken over by the ring.
Gollum is an example of what Frodo would become if he should fail.
Right.
Exactly, and as a direct manifestation of basically, him fighting off that weakness, constantly fighting the ring's power, and physically constantly fighting off Gollum, or trying to save him at least. In saving Gollum, he's saving himself.
And if we look at the story from a higher view, we can say that Gollum is, yes, the villain of the story in terms of Frodo, and that Saruman operates as Sauron in the flesh for the most part of the first two movies. But Sauron doesn't really function as a villain outside of being the architect of the plot. He orchestrates everything to happen, but he virtually has no control over it. It just I'm the ring. Ooh, don't throw me in the lava, dog.
I'll kill you if you
whatever
do.
you do, don't throw me in the lava. Just put me on real quick.
And the problem is that he already has all these armies and all this stuff, and it's like he already has so much control over Middle Earth. Like, what would be worse? And it's like I understand that in the extended material you can figure out what would be worse, but like it's never explained within the movie itself or the movies.
Well, I mean, it's just like it's more of that general threat, like I think maybe it came from like fears from war, where it's like, where is war going? And it's like a monster like it, or like Alien, where it just represents this like destruction, like an agent of chaos and destruction that we must oppose. We're naturally aligned with the protagonist because we want to survive as well.
A good example of another example of where the story decides to show like a future example is something like Supernatural, where like at least through the first 5 seasons, they're fighting off like the devil returning. He needs a body in order to do so, and we get a flash forward where we see Sam taken over by the devil and like the world that exists with him having returned. And so we can actually see the horrors that will happen if the villain succeeds. And then we go back, and now we understand, okay, these are the stakes. Another example I wanted to bring up was something like Full Metal Alchemist, which doesn't do the time leap, and instead, actually, the villain actually does succeed at the very end. He kills millions of people across the entire country so that he can become a god, and you can see the power he gets from it, and it's all holy fuck. And then because of what other characters have done, they're able to reverse it. So then he isn't able to contain that power, and he's ultimately defeated. But we do at least get a moment, like a scene or two, where he does have the ultimate power. Everyone is dead, and it's horrible. And so now we really understand the stakes of what happens, and then they reverse it, and you're like, hell yeah, dog! Because that was terrible.
I feel like maybe another like fairly mainstream one that everybody might know of is like Alduin from Skyrim, where, as the game storyline goes, when dragons used to exist, they lived to enslave or destroy all of mankind, and Alduin is supposed to be the forefront of that. And in Skyrim, when Alduin returns, the player character being the Dragonborn, Alduin is obviously the main villain. It's very obvious that he is supposed to be the main antagonist of your protagonist, and there's plenty of lore that gets introduced through the main storyline of Skyrim. What would happen if Alduin were to succeed? The entire world would turn to fucking ash, all of humanity would become slaves, or dead. So, like, obviously, you don't want that to happen. That, honestly, I feel like is a really good segue into what I feel like what would make a good villain, because where, as much as I love Sauron, and like I can say, Sauron thematically and idealistic or symbolically is a fucking badass and solid representation of a villain, I feel like we can very easily say the opposite to that because he doesn't have a lot of action. What I would say would bring a good villain to the table is you can actually see what the ramifications are if they're like major storyline, or their goal exactly is realized.
Yes.
So a really good one, the Netflix Castlevania. You start off and you realize you see Dracula as like kind of a person, and he falls in love with this woman, ends up having a child, and he loves her. And then one of the cities like burns her at the stake because she's in love with a vampire, right? And so that just flips the switch in Dracula for him to actually be Dracula and just like fucking destroy everybody, and his main goal is similar to Alduin, kill or enslave all of humanity. But in Castlevania, it's literally kill all humans, period. Every human dead, done. That makes them a powerful villain in my eyes because, obviously you don't want their goals to be reached because all of humanity would be dead.
Do you think, like, a lot of great stories is where the villain creates so much at stake that the whole world is threatened? Is that what makes a good villain?
Not necessarily. I mean, that can be a point of it, but another one is, like, Sadeas from the Stormlight Archive series is one of the first villains to appear in the story. And the reason why I love his character so much is because when he gets brought up and you realize his connections with Kaladin and the other characters of the story, he already has a lot intertwined with some of the other characters' narratives. When you look at Dalinar, him and Sadeas used to be like battle brothers, and now they fucking hate each other. Like, Sadeas is in charge of the army that Kaladin is a slave to. There's so much that makes you just hate him from the get-go. But as the story develops in the first book, they turn him in such a way that you understand why he does the things that he does, and the results that he gets are almost to a point where his methods are unquestionable. Because the way that he runs his army, hundreds of slaves die in almost every fight, right? With the bridge runners. But he's more successful than, like, any army that's in their country. More successful than Dalinar's, right? And Dalinar is, like, the head general, brother of the king, like, veteran, and Sadeas' tactics are quote-unquote better.
But we also get to see, like, him talking to other characters in confidence, especially his wife,
Yeah.
And, like, he explains his reason for, moving against Dalinar as, he thinks that he has to defend the country, and he thinks that Dalinar is losing his mind, basically.
Yeah.
But he also, like, we also get to see him, like, struggle with the morality of it, He's like, fuck, am I doing the right thing? And it's really great example of a good villain, because you get to understand his reasoning, and you get to see him as a person, not just as a, an icon of evil.
And, like, I don't want to go too much more into Sadeas, because for anyone who's listening, I highly recommend reading Stormlight Archive and figuring out what happens next. And another character from the same storyline would be Szeth. The way the whole story opens up is Szeth is the assassin in white who kills the king and sets everything in motion. And we know that after the story develops that Szeth is more of a pawn, right? He is being told what to do, but that does not make him any less of a villain, because he is the symbol of evil. When Szeth shows up, bad things happen. Who is incredibly menacing, he's incredibly powerful, his style of combat is both elegant and chaotic and horrifying to watch, and the chaos that ensues because of him and the stress that he puts on everything as soon as he shows up makes him another incredible villain.
Well, that reminds me of one of my favorite villains, is the Joker, who is obviously very crazy, is like the embodiment of chaos, but it's different from like the embodiment of evil like Sauron, because the Joker is very proactive. He's constantly doing something that's interesting, like he's always 2 steps ahead, like he's set up this whole elaborate schemes and plots, and you're like, he's just a much more interesting character, and like even his backstory embodies chaos because it's so many different backstories, and like you want to know more. You want to like, is this guy redeemable? Is he just like a symbolic foil to Batman? That's a good villain for me.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. I think that's a great example of a good villain. I would actually say that he is probably the perfect antagonist for Batman. He, just like a good villain, should basically serve the purpose of challenging the hero's weaknesses, and that's what the Joker does. He's constantly, challenging Batman to kill him. If you want all of the shit I'm doing to end, you have to kill me, which of course is the one thing Batman won't do. And so it's this constant
but he wants to.
Forth.
You know his
Yeah.
face. He's like, oh, you know I want to.
Right. And so that's what makes the Joker perfect, is because he's constantly challenging Batman at his, like, at the deepest level that Batman possibly has.
And that's a good villain. That if
That's
they're going to
exactly-
challenge you in your deepest value, if they can make you give up that.
It's like Gollum, you know. Again, it's the best antagonists, the best villains are the ones that actually challenge the hero's weaknesses and force them into making a decision about, are you going to let this thing overtake you, or are you going to triumph against it?
Right. And that's part of what makes him like the perfect antagonist to Batman, right? Is they are, in a lot of ways, it's, I think they even said it in the Dark Knight movie, it's what happens when an immovable object meets an unstoppable force.
I think the really interesting element to the Joker is that even the Joker, in his insanity, realizes that chaos doesn't exist without order. So another layer to why he won't kill Batman is because if the rules don't exist at all, then there's nothing left to break.
Along that point, I would actually argue, like you said, chaos requires order and vice versa. I would actually say that the main antagonist is as important, if not more important, than the protagonist, in that the protagonist can only be defined by the antagonists they come up against. You can only have a protagonist who shows their deepest parts of themselves by making choices against some sort of antagonistic force. And so the more powerful the antagonist, the deeper the weakness that antagonist is able to challenge, the more powerful your protagonist as well, and the more we understand about the protagonist. So if you're going to be writing a story, you might actually start with writing your antagonist first and how they challenge your protagonist.
Kind of circling back to what I said about the villain not necessarily being the antagonist of a storyline, is in the story of Breaking Bad, Walter White might start off as a good guy trying to do all this shit for his family, but when it comes to that story, the more and more it develops, the more and more Walter turns into a villain.
Right.
And the direct antagonist to him, I would say, is like Hank, right? Who is trying time and time and time again to stop the protagonist. But Hank is on the side of the law, right? Hank is the one that's trying to make sure that Walter faces justice and gets locked away. And just like you said, I feel like that it almost makes him more important than what's happening with Walter, because like Walter can kind of represent just like any other drug dealer. And when you bring up a main antagonist, you want their perspective and their morals and their, I guess a lot of their opinions to come up in direct conflict with whatever the protagonist is trying to go about.
It's so funny that you bring up Breaking Bad, because in the video that I'm working on right now, I'm talking about Breaking Bad. And that's I actually bring up Hank and how in any other story, Hank would have been the protagonist and Walter would be the villain. But because Walter is the protagonist, thus Hank is the antagonist, even though Walter is the villain, I'll go into detail more about that in my video, but it makes the story have to do different things than if it were told from the other perspective.
I think that the Hank-Walter point actually segues better into this anyway. So villains are often paradoxical in the way that we view them. We've been talking about villains and their function and their direct opposition to the hero, and how the villain can be more interesting and more proactive. And it's just strange that we can see the hero and villain as being diametrically opposed, especially in myth and like more classic good versus evil stories. We see them as being true opposites, especially like Batman and Joker. They're meant to be not only in character and in goal, but also like morally and symbolically entirely different. If we really look at the two characters, we can see that a lot of times they're actually very, very similar, and that the only difference between the two of them really is their methods.
They're definitely linked on some deep level.
A good example of that is like Luke and Darth Vader. There's a lot of similarities between the two of them, you know. They both want to bring the galaxy to a like divine order of some sort.
In a story like Star Wars, where we use the hero's journey, which I have to bring up, as I always have to bring it up, the stage 9, which is the exact middle point of the story, is the atonement with the Father, or sometimes the atonement with the Abyss. The hero usually meets a character or a force that represents all power. And a lot of times it is the villain, because the villain is usually the most powerful character, especially in myth, because it's good versus bad, and the bad guy's usually more powerful. Specifically in Star Wars. But you think about like a James Bond film like Skyfall, the villain will often like point out the similarities between the hero and themselves. And they'll say, hey, we're not so different. The two of us, the only difference between us is that I've been through more shit, and that I'm willing to do the more amorally corrupt thing to accomplish the same goal, essentially. It's just, I get it, you can't have it. And it's interesting to see a villain who is willing to go that far to accomplish a certain goal, because if you put an even more evil character next to them, suddenly they're the hero. It's just who's willing to do the worst thing. And when a bad guy, when the antagonist has a reasonable approach, it's hard to argue against them. Even if the hero is the better guy, sometimes the villain has a really good reason to do what they do. It's just they have the worst method in the room.
Yeah.
That reminds me of my only and favorite Avengers movie, Civil War, where they have like this moral dilemma throughout where they have to question, like, are they terrorists in a sense? Do they cause mayhem by trying to enact justice? Are they any better than the villains? And that's the antagonist at the end. That's his reveal. That's his like moral challenge, his final moral challenge to them. And he was just doing it out of revenge, right? Out of
Helmut
Zemo.
Zemo.
Okay, that's his name. So he was the main antagonist in Civil War, I believe. And Blake, the details of the movie, but
Sure.
at the end he was like, the Avengers created some kind of devastation in his life, and he was just acting out of revenge. He's being destructive just like them, and it's like, whose perspective is right?
Well, yeah, he's trying to act as a catalyst. So to segue, since we're already in the Marvel universe, we might as well look at Thanos. He's a great example of a villain that's really hard to argue against. Maybe not so in Endgame, but in Infinity War. Now it's been a while, so everyone's gone off the Thanos did nothing wrong train. But when it was fresh and we were all watching the movie in the theater, there was a moment that everyone experienced where it's like, did Thanos? He's kind of right, His goal is to wipe out half of life in the entire universe so that the other half can prosper, and it's like morally reprehensible to kill all half of life. Yeah, that's a terrible fucking thing to do. Would anyone else do it? No. Would we shake our heads if it happened and we couldn't ever undo it? Yeah, maybe for a minute, but the benefits of that, from a very objective, from a very high view down the line, would really help us. I don't know if it's supposed to be a metaphor or, an interpretation of overpopulation on the Earth or whatever, but Thanos is an interesting guy because he doesn't come off as being super evil. I mean, he's a dickhead and he does bad shit, but his ultimate goal is to preserve life, not destroy it.
I think that movie, just the way in which it's told, Thanos is actually like the protagonist of that movie. Like, just in the way that it I mean, he's obviously the villain or whatever, but just the way in which he pursues the goal. There's no other like challenging opponent or whatever that's really taking center stage. He's at the center of that movie. Everyone else is just kind of standing in his way, essentially. And so the way in which it's told, he's actually kind of the protagonist. Even though you're not necessarily hoping he's going to win, he's still the protagonist of the movie.
You're still kind of rooting for him.
He's the driving force, and he's the most interesting character.
So would you say that might, in fact, make Thanos an anti-hero of sorts?
Yes! Imagine me bringing that point up right before our next point.
Okay, so first off, let's kind of define what an anti-hero is. Thanos, to me, sounds like a pretty damn spot-on anti-hero, right? Where he's trying to do the right thing, but his methods aren't necessarily in the right place, where he wants to preserve all life by killing half of it. Like,
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd classify Thanos as an anti-hero in the classic sense of, the most sympathetic villain in the room. But there's a lot of other badder guys, and this guy is... I think the anti-hero actually functions as being, he's on the cusp of being a villain. Mm-hmm. He's doing bad shit. He's got morally reprehensible behaviors, but he was a decent guy before, and he's on that tipping point of, do I do the worst thing? Because that's how a lot of these anti-hero movies, the climax works, is that do they do the most reprehensible thing?
Right.
Or do they tip back into being the hero? Do they kill the villain, or do they decide not to? And I think that's the function of the anti-hero, is that they usually choose not to do the worst thing that they can possibly do. So I would say that Thanos doesn't quite qualify. Yeah,
as an anti-hero.
Yeah, he's got a good motivation, just a dog shit horrible method.
He's obviously not a hero because he's trying to kill half of humanity. But other examples of a good anti-hero like Vegeta. Vegeta starts off as a villain, and as soon as his view shift changes, or Frieza shows up, and Frieza is much more of a bad guy than Vegeta is, right? And Vegeta even warned Goku and friends that, holy shit, Frieza's gonna show up, we're all gonna die, and once he kind of turns his leaf, so to speak, he really becomes a hero without those more heroic attributes that Goku has, right? Where you can see that Goku is the kind of lawful good type character who wants to save the world, be the good guy, not breaking the rules, where Vegeta is I don't give a fuck about the rules, I'm just gonna prove that guy is wrong, and kind of goes about it in his own way.
Different motivations, but similar
goals.
Goals,
for sure.
But then also slightly different methods.
Yeah. And I think the methods are the methods that they go about their goal is a big part of what makes an anti-hero.
They're deeply flawed characters.
Yeah, that's sort of the prerequisite to be an anti-hero, is to be complex. Is that if they don't have some kind of dividing flaw within them that pushes them from good to bad and then maybe back again, then they don't really work that way. Because we can't really see Goku as being the type of guy who would become an anti-hero, because he's not willing to do really bad things. Nothing so terrible has happened to him that he's willing to do really bad things, except for, in that defining moment where he turned Super Saiyan for the first time. Killing Krillin pushed him to the point where he was willing to beat Frieza to literal death over it. But in that culminating moment of, fuck this guy, he's super weak now, I don't want to fucking fight him anymore. That's where he kind of tips back into being a hero. Once the challenge is gone, it's over. But since we're talking about villains and anti-heroes and the segue between them, let's talk about Walter White again.
Yeah.
Because we all know that's where it was going.
Yeah.
Well, we do. Walter is the kind of character that kind of represents... what was it that you said, Jack, about that Breaking Bad is about change?
Yeah, it's
a story about change, right?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Magoo becomes Scarface.
Right.
Yeah.
Walter is the embodiment of change, and then he becomes the embodiment of unable to change.
Yep.
He transitions pretty successfully from hero to anti-hero to villain, and it's a really interesting character study to look at him and see where the distinction lies. At what point does Walter become so bad? Right. When does he start making the bad decisions? And it's actually kind of hard to pinpoint throughout his story. When do we stop rooting for Walter? Mm-hmm. When does he become so bad? And I think it's different for a
lot of people, and some people it didn't.
Yeah,
it never happened, right?
Yeah, and I think that's depending on our own moral compass. But after a certain point, towards the end of the show, we can see that he has become such a bad guy that we don't trust him. We don't really want him to get what he wants. We want Jesse to get what he wants.
Right. Whereas when you first started, Jesse is kind of this little punk, and the more and more that story progresses, the more and more Walter, once he kind of becomes Heisenberg, right, where Walter starts going down that rabbit hole of just money and power and things, I'm gonna get what I fucking want because I'm a winner, and Jesse is like, you need to stop, man, this is not going to
Are we
end
doing the
well.
right thing?
Exactly. After a certain point, there's plenty of times where Jesse just walks out, and Walter's like, well, what do you mean, Jesse? Look at all this money, and we can do this,
But
and
meth.
Exactly. Walter just keeps pulling this poor kid in, and you feel so sympathetic towards him because, for me, I feel like one of the key points that turns Walter from a more anti-aspect to a villain aspect is when he goes to Jesse's house, lets Jane die. Jesse is in rags over it, and Walter's like, yeah, well, now you'll be my partner.
Maybe it's a little different for you, but for me, I disagree with the action itself. Yeah, I think he should have saved her, but at that point in the story, it seems like Walter was really hoping that would save Jesse from his potential overdose. He's still kind of someone that we can relate to. It's like, I don't want your fucked up friends to ruin your life, and if it came down to them or you, I'd pick you. At some point, there's a hard transition where Walter stops really caring about what Jesse really wants or needs, and he just keeps saying to himself, this is in Jesse's best interest. Down the line, this is going to work out for Jesse. And that validates him doing the most horrendous shit. It validates letting his girlfriend die. It validates poisoning his new girlfriend's kid. As long as it's in Jesse's best interest, I can keep doing this stupid shit. And then when Jesse doesn't fucking even matter anymore, that's when he's full villain. You know, there's no empathy. I don't give a shit about anybody else. I just do things for me now.
There's usually, when you have an anti-hero who you can relate to, there might be a moral event horizon, and that's basically when they pass the point of no return. So in Walter's case, that could have been at many points. It's like a slippery slope for him, right? Walter's descent, I don't know, it's like at first he murders out of self-defense, and then it becomes easier for him to just like not do anything and just let Jane die.
Yeah, after a certain point, he starts being proactive. He starts killing people before they become a problem. Like with Gale.
Right. Yeah. And it's an interesting development in the character. Like, we don't always want characters to improve themselves or be better. Sometimes we want to see how bad it can get. And that's like the appeal of villains. It's like why they're sometimes more interesting than the protagonists. And it's kind of like our, I don't know, some like dark need of humans or something to just see how bad things can get.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a very vicarious thrill to watch Walter descend into the bowels, especially when he doesn't have a problem with it anymore. As soon as he stops caring whether he is, morally upright, and he can start doing really bad shit, all for the same reasons as, the first season. Once he starts being that bad guy, we like to just watch him go, yeah, kill that guy. Fucking do it. Be the bad guy.
I think part of that might actually relate to how we were talking about, a good villain will see the ramifications of their plans, coming to fruition. And I think part of that is an interesting thing. It's like, okay, is this actually so bad? What happens once they reach their goal? And seeing that it's actually bad helps us understand why they shouldn't achieve it, or why somebody shouldn't do this, in reality. And so it's sort of a morbid curiosity,
Yeah.
But we also kind of learn from that experiment of seeing, how bad can it actually get? Is this actually a morally bad thing, or is it still a gray area?
And at the same time, like a character like Sauron seems uninteresting to me because Sauron's given no chance of change or to better himself. It's like he just is.
Like I said, Sauron doesn't really operate as a character. He's more of a symbol.
Right. And that's why he's not as interesting. Take note, writers. Take note.
Another thing I wanted to bring up, somewhat unrelated from the anti-hero, and we've talked about it a little bit here already, but this point I wanted to make was that a villain should be pursuing the same goal as the hero on some level, right? They're both working towards something that only one of them can achieve. If one of them gets it, the other cannot get it. And what this does is it forces them both into conflict and lets the audience understand the moral or psychological argument that's happening between them. This goes back to, the midpoint of the story that SK was talking about, where they're saying, we're the same, we're trying to do the same thing, right? They're both trying to achieve the same thing. They're just going about it in different ways. And every time the antagonist or the protagonist are forced to make a decision, we learn more and more about what's important to the protagonist and what's important to the antagonist and what the overall conflict is that we're discussing here within this story.
And sometimes you just got a bunch of villains and no heroes at all.
I mean, yeah.
Like, sometimes you have a story where there's no real heroes. Just kind of questionable morals. And I think you have to see Rick within the morality of the Rick and Morty universe, where the very question of morality is raised by the existence of infinite or whatever dimensions, where it's almost any action is of no consequence at all because they just go to another dimension. So it doesn't matter if someone dies because there's an infinite million copies of them. So it's like, how do you define morality in that kind of world that they inhabit? And he's likable because they still set him up as like a grandpa. He cares about his family. Every morning, they're eating breakfast or something together as like a kind of sitcom entrance, and it's like, oh, they're a happy family, until Rick's like, okay, I'm done, I'm gonna go cause some chaos. Yeah, it's very conflicted, and I think that's interesting about him.
There does become points where, like, Rick isn't necessarily a villain of that story. Like, he's in a weird little, like, category, kind of, where I wouldn't exactly qualify him as an anti-hero either. Like, he's kind of, while he has that, like, inner confliction that a lot of anti-heroes do, of, like, you know, he has one side of him that's just like, I don't give a fuck, I'm gonna do whatever I want because I'm the smartest guy in the fucking universe or whatever. And, like, even when it comes to the other Ricks of the other Ricks, right, that try and stop him, he tries to prove time and time and time again that he is the Rickest Rick, right?
Yeah.
He's the most Rick out of all of the Ricks. And what I mean by that is he is in that state of mind where, like, he's only really going to do whatever he wants without so much caring what other people think of him or what other people's interests might be. But the internal conflict kind of gets raised because like, when you take a character like Morty, for example, while he is using Morty, he does give a shit about Morty. You know, like, he does actually care about Morty, and a lot of I feel like there's a good part of that storyline where, you know, you take in the first season where Morty's like, I'm fed up with you, Rick, like, I want to go on my adventure, we're going to do things my way this time, right? And he kind of gets to that point. Yeah, like, it's horrible, you know, it's all awful. They go to this weird, like, fantasy land, you know, but Rick is just giving him shit the whole fucking time, and then once Morty gets to that point where he's just like, nah, I want to go home. I almost got raped by a jelly bean. Like, let's get the fuck out of here. You know, Rick is kind of like, nah, hold on, though. Like, look, I just want a bunch of schmeckles. Let's pay some to, like, let's use some to get down the stairs by the giant slug snail monster guy, Slippity Sam the snail, or whatever the fuck. And then we'll give the rest to the villagers, and, you know, we'll call it a good day. And, you know,
like a dysfunctional grandpa.
Right, exactly. And so, like, while the entire time he's, like, giving Morty shit, this is fucking dumb, why don't you call it quits? Once Morty kind of reaches that point where he's just like, you know what, like, I lost, okay, fine, you're right, I don't care anymore, I just want to go home, and, like, Rick can see that Morty is in a moment of, like, disarray. He tries to, like, pull him under his wing, and it's just like, okay, you know what, come on, let's have some fun, like, this is your thing, let's go. You know, and he does give a shit, where, no matter where his morality lies, he does give a shit.
I'd also point out that, like, you know, in a lot of stories where there's a villain, like an actual villain, you know, maybe the main character calls him out, like, oh, you're evil, like, it's not a they don't really challenge them very much. They just are, you know, complaining while the villain does what they do. Whereas in Rick and Morty, when Rick does fucked up shit, like, all the other characters call him out on it and, like, actually attack, like, weaknesses and shit he has. Like, they point out flaws in his character and whatever else. They don't just go, this is bad. They dig at him. So it actually, by doing that, by having the other characters challenge him, it actually allows the audience to not judge him as much, because we understand now that, like, okay, these other characters aren't just, like, his victims. They're standing up for themselves. He's not just this all-powerful, morally all-powerful and unquestioned villain. He is this dude who lives with other people and, like, has to compromise and whatever else, you know. So it brings him down to a more human level. Otherwise he would just be this fucking maniac who's going all over the place and is never questioned by anybody, or is just like,
he is way overpowered.
I mean,
overpowered.
But without that, like, it wouldn't really be much of a story.
And to that point, you know, generally any villain should have some weakness to be exploited by the hero or other characters. I mean, obviously, that's not always going to be the case, but a villain without a weakness isn't somebody who is defeatable. And that's fine if that's your intention. If you are, you know, painting the picture of, like, this villain is so powerful they can't be defeated, and then the hero loses, because of that, and it's like, okay, that that might be the point of your story, right? That this form of conflict is not winnable. But in any other moment where the hero is supposed to win, if the villain doesn't have a weakness that can be exploited or used to defeat them, then it's going to require a Deus Ex Machina to defeat them, and that's really unsatisfying. And it really just means that they weren't a well-suited villain for your hero. They didn't actually challenge the hero on a psychological or moral level. They weren't anybody that the hero could actually converse with and have a back and forth. It's some big bad thing that then went away.
There are very, very few instances where I feel like that sort of plot device is portrayed. I feel like one of the only ones that's coming to mind that I actually kind of enjoyed, this like Deus Ex Machina sort of thing, is in like Avatar: The Last Airbender. They had to do things before a certain time because like this meteor was going to show up and make all the firebenders super fucking powerful, and the Deus Ex Machina that like plot device that was kind of thrown in was when they gave Aang the ability to like energy bend, right? And so he's fighting the Supreme Fire Lord at the very end, and in order to defeat him, rather than like killing him or anything like that, he takes away the guy's ability to bend, right? He takes away his ability to influence the elements, so he is just a regular fucking guy. The way that they went about that, I feel like is something that I could actually get behind, because, it's not just like this like once in a lifetime 1,000,000 to 1 odds sort of defeat. They actually gave him a solid plot device that like only he can do because he's the avatar that might work. But if it doesn't, you're gonna get murdered by his overpowering spirit. Like, whatever.
Well, the reason that we're okay with it is because the entire series has been building up to the idea that this little kid has to kill this guy.
Right.
And he doesn't want to.
Right.
He wants to find any other way to beat him without killing him, but it seems like killing him is the only way to stop him because he's a literal psycho.
Right.
So, in terms of the Ex Machina effect of he needs this new ability to take the Fire Lord down without killing him, it's something we're okay with because it actually is well within Aang's character.
Yeah, and it feels satisfying.
Yeah, it's the ending we wanted. And we didn't know we wanted it until we saw it. So I wouldn't exactly call it an Ex Machina because it's within Aang's ability to do so. It's just, the way that it's introduced is kind of like a very last minute.
So, yeah, it is very last minute. Giant turtle lion island monster shows up and he's like, oh, hey, Aang, by the way, if I touch your forehead, you can do this. And then, he doesn't, learn it. It doesn't, there's no real character development as far as, how he's able to do it. It's just kind of like, you can do this now. Okay, go.
Well, let me ask you, is that, was that turtle or whatever that it came from a character throughout the story?
No.
Really? It literally was just, this random-ass thing showed up. Here's the power!
They mention it before as, a cosmic kind of being that no one's seen in a long time.
And then I'm pretty sure Aang goes to the spirit world and figures out how to find it, and once he actually does, he presents the lion turtle with his problem where he's like, look, everybody wants me to kill this guy and I just can't fucking do it. I can't kill him. And he's like, okay, well, I'm going to teach you how to do this, and I have to let you know that if I teach you how to do this, with great power comes great responsibility, quote unquote, and you might die if you try. So,
well, that tells me though that that's something that the story was leading up to. He actually made an active decision to call for this thing that could probably help him. So he still gained the power through his own means. I would classify Deus Ex as
actually he gets a trance in the second to last episode or the last episode to get this power. He doesn't actively pursue the lion turtle to get this ability.
Oh, okay.
The thing is,
I don't know. I haven't seen the show. So
the thing about it is that even if Aang doesn't actively pursue it, if he doesn't take the direct action to do so, the theme within the show for Aang is about transcendence and mastery of self and enlightenment. So it actually falls really well in line with his character change. So I don't really have a problem with it. Yeah, it's a little bit of a gimme, but I really don't have a problem with it because it's epic.
Yeah,
right.
It's a gift. It's a gift from the gods. Here you go. Yeah. Here's the sword that kills the dragon. You need this. You could kill him otherwise, but this is going to make it so that you can live with yourself after.
And I feel like that is a really, really good way to bring up the next point, where you have this all-powerful villain, and time again, the villain defeats good guy leaves. Like when you look at a Dragon Ball Z sort of scenario, the villain is kind of very often this all-powerful being that nobody can defeat, right? In either a physical, mental, or spiritual aspect. He's unbeatable, right? And then the hero kind of tilts the scales eventually by whatever means gets brought up throughout the story, but they eventually get to this point of strength where the villain is kind of been at this plateau of what they believe to be the strongest ever, quote unquote, and the hero is like, I don't believe you, and they eventually get to that point where they can become stronger, and I've written storylines where that's been the case in a book or two, and like I believe I already brought up Dragon Ball Z, but that like in the Cell series, Cell is murdering everybody, and he's just like, ha ha ha, fucking bring it on, I'm Cell, nobody can beat me, and then Gohan is like, you killed my dad and all my friends, bah, like
Exactly.
and he's like, oh shit, woke the dragon, and like that's exactly what happens. Is Gohan reaches this point of power that nobody even believed possible, but the villain pushed him so far as to achieve this new pinnacle.
And, part of what makes that work is that the villain, has some sort of weakness that basically allows the hero to rise beyond them, right? They have some weakness that's actually holding them back from digging deeper and finding that hidden strength or whatever and rising up. Is usually what it is, right? A villain is destroyed because they don't overcome their weakness, generally.
Yeah, I think a good villain will contain the seeds of their own destruction. I don't know if did we mention it before, Stephen King? I think a little bit, but
not in this version.
Yeah, a giant space spider that can fuck with your mind pretty hard. Its greatest weakness is when the characters realize that if they don't fear it, it loses its power. Its power comes in the fear it inspires. So by them finding that out and learning to overcome their fear by facing it, they're able to defeat it, which seemed like the most badass motherfucking thing that you couldn't possibly destroy. It's like a fucking godlike space spider. And that's it comes to like the point of villains about how do you tell stories about humans overcoming a great challenge,
right?
Trying to tie it into the whole storytelling art. What can stories tell us about integrity?
When you look at villains' weaknesses, there's a lot of things that come into play, but for me, a lot of times, where you are given a villain that has a lot, or that has this one like physical weakness, it's not as powerful of a weakness than something like an emotional or psychological weakness that there would be to exploit. If, like, when you look at the story of Troy, you take Achilles and his physical weakness is like he's the strongest fighter, immortal god ever, best on the battlefield ever, but if you nick him in the heel, flink, he's dead. Like, okay, that's kind of stupid in my opinion, and like I understand he was dipped in the river Styx by his heel, and that's the only part of his body that does not get imbued with that power, so that's his only physical weakness is his heel. I feel like is a little bit, it's not as satisfying to me when you look at other villain psychological weakness, where with Cell, it's more his pride that defeats him than Goku or than Gohan's like physical strength. Where like yes, Gohan's physical strength eventually gets to a point that overpowers Cell, but Cell's emotional weakness of being a pride and ego monster is what pushes Gohan to that point that he can defeat Cell.
And it's what holds him back. He doesn't think he needs to to train. He's already the best.
Exactly.
Why would I need to try to be better?
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
yeah. The weaknesses of a villain are really, they're tied to the central conflict of the story. So in that specific example, Cell's weakness being pride, it's pride versus Gohan's self-doubt. Right. And that's kind of the root of the central conflict of that story is those two weaknesses, those two ideas going head to head.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. You talk about the idea about like what are the ideas behind villains? Like it might be that if you face your fears, you find that the fear will resolve, or the Joker's that like although if you're surrounded by chaos, you have to stick to your moral code. You have to not indulge in the darkness, even though it is all-encompassing.
Right. And that just about wraps us up. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Matt, thank you for being on.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I really I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, sir. God bless.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me, and everybody who's listening, I hope you enjoyed the experience.
Now, SK will enjoy the editing.